You're listening to the Fig Culture Podcast, the show that helps cold climate gardeners bend the rules, push zone boundaries, and grow figs anyways. I'm your host, Stephen Biggs. This is a different sort of episode. It's a tribute to Bob Duncan, the remarkable fruit grower, nurseryman, and teacher from Sydney, British Columbia, who recently passed away. Bob spent years showing gardeners that the line between possible and impossible isn't always where we think it is. At Fruit Trees and More, the nursery and demonstration orchard he ran with his wife Verna, he grew an astonishing range of fruit: figs, lemons, olives, yuzu, loquat, avocados, and much more. I wrote about Bob's work in my books about growing figs, lemons, and olives in cold climates, and over the years he was extraordinarily generous with his knowledge. If I had an obscure question, Bob usually had the answer. More importantly, though, he'd explain the thinking behind it. I've gone back through some of the old recordings from my visits and interviews with Bob. Some were made while we walked through his garden with a bunch of garden writers. Others come from phone interviews. They're a bit rough in places, but I wanted you to hear Bob in his own voice, practical, curious, and quietly willing to disregard accepted wisdom. Near the end of one interview, I asked how an entomologist who had grown apples, peaches, and cherries came to start growing lemons outdoors on Vancouver Island. His answer gives this episode its title.
It just wasn't on the radar screen that many of these typically Mediterranean tree fruits could be grown in our climate. Nobody ever even considered it. I mean, lots of people grew them in containers or whatever, but nobody ever thought to grow them in the ground out here. I recognize that, in true Mediterranean climates like California or Spain or Italy or Turkey, frost is a totally normal occurrence. And yet you see all these interesting subtropical or Mediterranean fruits flourishing there in a climate where frost is quite normal in the winter. I just looked at the Victoria situation and I said, that's largely us. Frost is a common occurrence here in the winter, but temperatures, serious freezes, are relatively rare and getting rarer as we go along. And I thought to myself, it's worth trying this. Let's try it.
Let's try it. It wasn't a reckless sort of experiment. Bob paid close attention to climate, walls, winter lows, summer heat, and the stage of growth of the plant. But he was willing to challenge the typical recommendations. One of the best examples was his Meyer lemon. He planted it against a wall, protected it during the occasional cold spell, and kept watching what happened. By the time of this interview, it had occupied a wall about 16 feet wide and 9 feet high. What's your harvest been like on great years?
The oldest plant that I have, which is about 20 years, planted directly in the ground, it's about 20 years old. It occupies a wall space about 16 feet wide by about 9 feet high. That produces something over 400 lemons every year.
400?
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
One time when I visited to interview Bob in person, he delayed harvesting so that I could see all of those lemons. He was generous and thoughtful that way. But more than 400 lemons from one plant. This wasn't a heated conservatory. It was a carefully chosen spot, a hardy variety, and a grower who understood that protection might be needed on a handful of nights, but not for the entire winter. Bob also made an important distinction when people asked how cold hardy a lemon tree was. The first question, he said, wasn't simply whether the tree survived. It was whether the fruit survived.
I was wondering if you could tell me about hardiness differences between varieties.
Okay, so Stephen, I'm going to back up just one step from the question you asked. I will answer your question, but I'm going to just say one other thing before I answer it, and that is, with lemons, the fruit is on the tree in the winter. So what's is really the question to ask is what temperature does the fruit freeze at? Because you could have a temperature that the tree is hardy to, but the fruit is not. And that often happens with many types of citrus. So you could have a temperature that the tree would survive, but it would freeze the fruit. Okay. So going back to your question with the lemons then, the fruit question, and by the way, the temperature of the fruit of citrus is at risk is anything below -3. But in terms of the tree itself, the Meyer lemon is considered the hardiest. Most sources will say about -6 for the tree. That's assuming it's fully dormant. Like if it's in active growth, of course, all bets are off. And another part to that equation is that's assuming the tree is a mature and well-established tree. If you have a little wee nursery plant that you bought, a containerized plant that's only a foot or two high, and it's the very first winter, it wouldn't necessarily be hardy to -6. But a tree that's been in the ground, say 5 years or something, that's well established and has got a fairly thick trunk on it, would be hardy to -6. Now to expand further, the rest of the lemons, the Lisbon and the Eureka and the Genoa and the Lemonero, the Fino and other Italian varieties, they're mostly considered to be hardy to about -4. So in other words, the temperature the fruit freezes at and the temperature the tree could be damaged at are pretty similar. But with the Meyer, the tree itself is considerably hardier than the freezing temperature of the fruit. So that's the thing that gardeners out here who can plant them in the ground have to remember is that the temperature the fruit will freeze at. So here in Victoria, that's the number of times the temperature could reach -3 in an average winter is typically between 5 and 10 nights.
That distinction between keeping a tree alive and bringing a crop to harvest runs through so much of Bob's advice. Survival is only part of growing fruit. The short recordings from Bob's garden have a different sound, and you can hear that we're moving from plant to plant. I'd like to share a few of them with you, beginning naturally with figs.
And the pruning system that I'm using here is a Japanese system, which actually superficially looks a lot like the UFO system.
So is that with the 45-degree angle?
No, it's the trunk.
Offshoot.
Yeah, the main stems are running parallel to the ground with verticals coming off of it.
Okay.
And those figs that we were looking at were in Bob's open-sided greenhouses because the Pacific Northwest has mild winters, but not the sustained summer heat that's needed to ripen a dependable main crop of figs. So Bob's answer was capture more heat with the open-sided greenhouses, and he was trying all sorts of different ways to grow figs within those greenhouses, including that training method that he was just describing.
In our climate here on the West Coast, typically the only figs that ripen are the Breba figs. And when you look at the world of figs, the hundreds, maybe thousands of varieties, and there's certainly hundreds of varieties of figs out there, the vast majority of them have two crops, a Breba crop on the previous year's wood and a main crop on the current year's growth. Having said all that, most varieties of figs have a relatively small Breba crop and a huge main crop. Here in the West Coast, the main crop doesn't ripen, so varieties that have a relatively small Breba crop and a huge main crop don't do you any good out here. What you want is the reverse. You want figs that have a huge Breba crop, since the main crop doesn't ripen, on average. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, what I've said there, but that's the general rule. So what we're trying to do here is find as many Breba figs varieties as we can and trial them here and see what works and what doesn't work. We've been to the Mediterranean many times. We've made extensive collections of figs in pretty much around the Mediterranean basin. And we're trialing those. Plus, there are other places in North America where there are fig collectors. And I think, though, have you heard of the fig called Olympia?
I've heard it. I've never grown it.
Okay, and you've also heard of English brown turkey as opposed to California brown turkey. Mm-hmm. I think English brown turkey, Olympia, your Bugasoda, and the Dulce Brown are either very closely related or they're the same thing. So they do have substantial Breba, like you said.
And so they're all very similar in there.
The physical characteristics of the fruit is very similar. So, but anyways, yeah, so that's what we're doing here. Now, the other thing that I've done as well is I've started root restricting figs because I want to have as much diversity in as small a space as possible because I only have so much space. Yeah, so the way that's evolved over time, but the most recent iteration of it is using ground cloth, which that stuff, you see that stuff there, the figs are sitting on. Essentially, it's a fig pit, if you will, and instead of being lined with the traditional slabs of concrete or slate like they do in England, it's lined with ground cloth. I've had some of that exposed to sunlight for more than 30 years, and it looks as good today as it did 30 years ago. Wow. So in other words, it seems to be indestructible. Now, what I have done, I have poked a few nail holes in the bottom. I don't know whether I needed to do that, but I did. So essentially, what I want to do is essentially restrict the root growth and maybe let a tiny little bit of roots come through, but not wholesale. There are no dwarf rootstocks for figs. Like you can keep an apple small or a citrus small by grafting them on a dwarfing rootstock, but you can't do that with a fig. So how are you going to keep a fig tree small? Root restricted. Okay. Now, I am actually working with main crop figs too, and I'll show you shortly what we're doing with that. Okay. As I said, our climate here on the West Coast, on average, is not warm enough to ripen main crop figs. I mean, there are exceptions, as I said, to that, but just on average, most of the varieties do not ripen main crop figs. So I'm doing some things to try to ripen main crop figs, and it's early days with that program. And I'll show you in a minute what I'm talking about.
And with ones you're experimenting with for the Brebas.
Yes.
So Grantham Royal, Desert King, everybody knows those. Are there any ones that really...
Well, again, that Olympia.
The Olympia.
That one is a heavy, heavy Breba.
For gardeners in areas without sustained summer heat, like in the Pacific Northwest, those fig varieties with a heavy Breba crop can be far more dependable than depending on main crop figs. So that was a real focus of Bob's. And if you tune in to the first fig culture episode, it's Bob talking about some of his top picks for heavy Breba production. Then there were the olive trees, growing against the side of his house, covered with remay and incandescent lights for the winter.
Yeah, and this is just early September, and we won't be picking those till at least December.
Is this set up as well for the remay and Christmas lights if needs be?
Yes, yeah. Although, listen, if this works out and I can pick these in December, you probably won't even need the remay because the trees themselves are totally hardy here. Oh. It's just the vulnerability of the fruit. And if we can pick the fruit in the early part of the winter, we may not have to do much in the way of protection.
When I began experimenting with olives here in Toronto, Bob was one of the people I turned to. Our climates are very different, but the way he separated a plant's needs, winter survival, summer heat, fruit development, helped me think much more clearly about what I was attempting. And I did come home with an olive tree in a suitcase after visiting Bob once. Bob wasn't interested only in forcing tender plants into unlikely places. Sometimes the better answer was to find a plant already suited to the job. And yuzu is a perfect example.
Well, okay, so I classify citrus three ways. Mm-hmm. There's acid citrus, meaning lemons and limes, which here on the West Coast can be grown like a peach against the south or west wall with an overhang.
Okay.
Then there's sweet citrus, which would be navel oranges and grapefruits and tangelos and things like that. Mm-hmm. A bit more summer heat to produce sweet fruit. And so I consider those best suited to unheated greenhouses here on the coast. Mm-hmm. And then there's the third category, which is exactly exactly what you come to, which is the yuzu and the sudachi, which are hardy to about -12. And fruit in Japanese culture is usually harvested when it's still green. In other words, like limes. Like limes go yellow, you know that, right?
Yes.
The tree, they go from green to yellow, but they're normally harvested when they're still green. So yuzu is like that. The yuzu will go orange when it's fully ripe, but they're harvested in Japan while they're still green. Now, so what you've got is a situation where you've got a tree that's hardy to -12. You've got a fruit that's harvested here in late October, November, before winter happens. So you see where I'm going with that? We don't get -12 here. So that means that you can grow these Japanese citrus just like an apple tree or a pear tree right out in the middle of your yard. No wall, no winter protection, no nothing. It's just pretend it's an apple tree out in the middle of your yard. And it will totally handle our winters here and reliably ripen the fruit before the -3 fruit freezing temperature could occur.
That's such a useful way to think about citrus. Lemons and limes don't need the summer heat required to sweeten an orange, and yuzu can tolerate much colder winter temperature, and its fruit is harvested before the coldest part of winter arrives.
We pioneered growing the lemons and limes outside on a wall like a peach more than 20 years ago.
Right.
We've been growing sweet citrus in essentially unheated greenhouses for as long. But this growing citrus like an apple tree, in other words, pretending you're living in San Diego and just having a citrus in the middle of your yard, was hitherto unknown.
Yeah.
That there was any citrus that you could do that with. But you can, and there's two reasons why that's so. The tree's hardy to -12, which we never get here, and the fruit's ripe before winter. So you don't have to worry about the -3 rule. Like all the other citrus, it's on the tree in the winter, and that -3 becomes the limiting factor.
Okay.
That doesn't apply here because you pick it before winter.
Bob could make an unusual plant field possible, but he was equally good at bringing a conversation back to the basics. Ask him for his top advice about growing citrus in a pot, and he didn't begin with an unusual fertilizer or some kind of elaborate pruning system. He began with water.
I consider the number one issue that people growing citrus in containers have is water management. With a pot, when you water it to the point of water coming through the drain holes, the lower quarter or so of the pot remains saturated in spite of those holes being there initially until the leaves do evapotranspiration, pull that water out.
Yeah.
In other words, it doesn't just through the laws of physics 100% drain, opening up all the air pores right through to the bottom of the pot. The air pores in the lower quarter remain saturated. So what I tell people is try to maintain even moisture, but not soggy. I'm not telling people to outrightly drought their plants, but, water them well, and then don't water them again until you can tell that a lot of the water's been pulled out. And if the pot's small enough, you can tell it just by picking it up. Like you know what it feels like shortly after you've watered it. It's heavy and soggy and whatever. Wait till it's a bit lighter than that before you water it again without droughting it. Like if you severely drought it, they'll drop their leaves.
Yes.
You don't want to go right to that extent. But if it's non-stop soggy, they're going to drop their leaves too and die. Keep them on the dry side and moist. In other words, there's moisture there, but it's on the dry side.
The dry side of moist. Bob had a gift for a phrase that was both precise and easy to remember. He also understood the reality of giving advice across Canada. His suggestions worked beautifully in coastal BC, but occasionally would need a small footnote for places like Winnipeg.
The other issue when you make houseplants out of citrus is, one, of course, you're going to collect dust and so on, and they will look rather unsightly eventually. But more importantly is the drier inside environment makes it actually easier for the pest. So So if spider mites or scale insects or something like that were even dreaming about getting going on your citrus, what they like is warm, dry, dirty, dusty. In other words, conditions that you commonly get in houseplant situations or even in a greenhouse, where you're out of the wind and dirt and dust and hot and dry conditions can occur. So what I often suggest is that you actually, on top of the misting down initially to get them used to the drier environment, is that you periodically, through the winter months, in a period that you have them inside, that you mist them down occasionally. And I will often suggest, if it's a potted specimen and if it's possible to take them into a space where you can mist them down with a mist head on your hose with the shade, in the middle of January in Winnipeg. But it may not be possible to take them outside and mist them down at all. But here in Victoria, of course, you can do that easily.
Yeah.
That little aside makes me smile. Bob was serious about plants, but never solemn. Bob Duncan changed what many Canadian gardeners believed they could grow. He did it by experimenting, observing, and sharing what he learned. He didn't simply display remarkable plants. He helped other people understand how to grow them. I'm grateful for every conversation I had with him and for the generous way he answered my questions over the years. His work appears in my books about figs, lemons, and olives because in each case, he helped move the edge of possibility. My condolences to Bob's wife, Verna, to Bob's family, and to the many gardeners who learned from him. A public celebration of Bob's life will be held on Monday, August 24th at 2 p.m. at the Mary Winspear Centre in Sydney, British Columbia. I'll include the details in the episode notes. I want to leave you with Bob's voice once more. Not the whole explanation this time, just the thought at the heart of it.
Frost is a common occurrence here in the winter, but temperatures, serious freezes, are relatively rare and getting rarer as we go along. And I thought to myself, it's worth trying this. Let's try it.
You're listening to the Fig Culture Podcast. I'm Stephen Biggs.